Okay, great. And I'm sharing my screen, but I don't think you can see anything yet. Can you see something now? You see the lecture contents and the demo and notes thing? Cool.
Yeah, we see it.
Yeah, we got you.
So let me put the demo and notes thing on another page, but we will be going back and forth to it. And this is the content. This is new content. You might need to pull from both demos and notes and the curriculum because the content was updated relatively recently. It's all in week 8 now, which is correct, but I put some of it in week 7 initially. So if I overwrote anything from week 7, let me know and I'll try and fix that very soon. Yes, so the topic of today is React. I think it might be worth, if anyone is willing to volunteer, can we just get like a 1-minute summary of maybe like what we did in the last few weeks or something?
I would tell you if I knew.
Okay, fair enough. I mean, I also don't know that well because I wasn't there. But from what I understand, you were mostly working in backend, right? And some of that was SQL, but then eventually you were writing endpoints, and those endpoints allowed you to communicate with this server. And up until now, as the programmer, you've been doing the server side of things. And if you were to serve anything up, it was once and done. They asked for a certain bit of data, maybe it was HTML or something like that. You just serve it right up. And we're about to get into the world of front end, and front end does mean, at least initially, just serving something up. So you have some HTML page, maybe you use Django templates, and you might create an HTML page sort of on the fly, but an HTML page is kind of this thing that already exists, and you send it out. And once you send it out, that's the end of the transaction. They use that HTML page. That's kind of where it ends. It doesn't feel like a constant feedback loop. Right. So as you see, we have a lot of topics to cover here, but what we're going to be doing mainly is first talking about what is React, what we have seen already in terms of the front end. And then we're going to do this little hello world thing, by which I mean, basically, we're going to do whatever steps we have to get to a point where we have sort of the basic scaffolding of a project just so we could see hello world on the screen. And that obviously, seeing hello world is trivial. That's not much of a website. But React kind of is a bit heavy in the tooling department. You kind of have to have a bit of tooling set up. So I really want to spend time walking through that so we can, feel confident that we can create our own React project, even if it's just write the words hello world. And then the rest of class, we're just going to talk about React, so-called intro to React. There's a bunch of things to cover, but the essentials are the concept of a component, the concept of props. And then I think this is an important section to include, which is just common patterns in React, because there's things you're going to want to do over and over again. And it's good to see sort of a canonical example of what a good way of doing it is. And then finally, something we're going to try and introduce over the next bunch of days, all the days that we do React, is we're going to build a project in class together. And we're going to keep building on it day to day. So for today, we're hoping to, get the basic scaffolding set up and then create a basic homepage for this video store, which we'll get into that a little bit more at the end. And then just display a list of videos visually. Cool. And I wanted to hold myself to a sort of time thing. So we have 3 hours today, and sometimes we run over, sometimes less. Currently, we're 5 minutes in. It's often hard to tell when you're lecturing just where you are. So my plan is to spend the next 40 minutes on this first part of, what is React to the first, creating your first component. So that gives me 40 more minutes, and then I'll give you a 15-minute break. I kind of want to stick to that so that we can have time for everything. Cool. Okay, so first I want to mention we have it all the way at the bottom here, but if you look all the way at the bottom, there's going to be, you see there's a lot here. There's a link here, react.dev/learn. So React actually, let me move it to a page that has nothing to do with my stuff. As you see, I'm building a Lego set, of course. Yeah, so React recently redid all their docs. Like they literally just pushed it from react.beta.dev to react.dev. And this is the best tutorial you're going to find for learning React. It's very thorough. What I created is not as thorough as it because we have a little less time. But if you have any questions in the process of learning React, this is a really great resource because it will cover not just like quick start, not just thinking in React, installation, like all this stuff. But its best feature by far is that you have these little boxes where, I can change the text here, and that's going to update. And, this is a great learning resource because you don't have to worry about setup. It's just you get to modify something and see it actually happen in real time. So just keep that resource in mind. Okay, so what is React? According to React's own flagship site, they describe themselves as a library for web and native user interfaces. So let's break that down a little. You've used Django a fair amount, and Django counts as a framework. So these concepts are not always so different, but there is a difference between a framework and a library. A framework is something where the framework makes a lot of decisions for you and is sort of self-aware of your code, and then you fill in the details. So like when you use Django, you just write, you make this new variable called, URLs or whatever it's called, URL patterns equals, and then you give it this set of, name of a route to route handler. And yet you never say to Django, hey, Django, you need to know about this thing called URL patterns and run something. Like you're not really running the code, you're filling in the details and Django is doing it all for you. React is a little different in that React is a true library. Just like, when you use the CSV library in Python, for example, a library just gives you a set of functions and says, use these functions to create something. And that's actually all React is. It's just a library, which makes it simpler in a lot of ways and easier to learn in some ways and more easily integratable with other things. You'll see what it is when we get to it. It's not that it's any less complicated, really. It's just it is a library. Second, it's designed for creating user interfaces. So up until now, the only way we've been able to create a user interface is with HTML. And when we want to add JavaScript, we had vanilla JavaScript of the form of, just looking for a certain element and then modifying some attribute of that element or something along those lines. And React is supposed to be a replacement for that. It's going to be our user interface solution for the web. And then importantly, for web and native. So part of the reason people care so much about React is that React was originally made to help build websites. And a cool thing about React compared to like Google's flagship web framework Angular is that Facebook really does build virtually everything in React. It's not just a product they're trying to sell other developers. They invented it because it was the best way to solve their problem. And they have a pretty complex website. So it's cool that that is a good use case to say your website can probably be done in this as well. But they eventually created this second project called React Native, which you can look at here. And React Native lets you basically take the same idea of writing React, but doing it for the sake of creating an Android or iOS app. And it's called React Native because it's actually a native app. It's not a lot of cross-platform app things. You're really just running a browser and then you're putting whatever in the browser. But this is actually going to produce native code, and you have access to native features on the phone, like a camera or whatever's in iOS or Android. It's not identical to React because as you see here, like what is a view? That is not a concept that exists in web development, but it is a concept that exists in the UI of mobile apps. And so there are going to be things that are unique about it, but it's very much the same approach. And so it means that once you learn this skill, you're not just capable of doing React, but you can also do React Native. And that really opens up a whole world of possible jobs, basically. So what have we seen so far in terms of front end? So everything React does is what people call the view layer. So the view layer, you may have heard of this thing called MVC, Model View Controller. The important points are the M and the V. So the M, the model, is ultimately represented by your database. The model is just the source of truth, it's data. And then the V is like the website, what it looks like, how a user interacts with it. And the C, the controller, is everything else that hooks those two together. Everyone agrees about the M and the V. There's often confusion about what the C should actually look like. Angular used to market itself as MVVM model. No, either model view, view model, or MVW, model view, whatever. The point is that there's these two essential ideas: model, which is sort of the data model backing some visual thing, and then the visual thing itself. And React initially is only supposed to solve the visual layer. So up until this point, to solve the visual layer, we've had HTML, and Django templates kind of built on that a little because it let us write HTML in a way that gave us sort of conditionals, sort of loops, sort of parameters. We weren't just giving a page of HTML. We could actually, modify it slightly as if it were a function or something. We could give it some input, and then it would produce an output that, let's say you gave it a list of data, it would actually show that whole list in HTML. But still, once it was created, you sent it over. And then if you wanted to modify that HTML once it was on the client side, you used vanilla JavaScript. So quickly, we're just going to look at what that looks like. In demos and notes for today, there should be something called HTML vanilla JS. So I'm going to look at that right here. Sorry for all the jumping around. So if I look at week 8, day 1, HTML vanilla JS, I have these two things, an HTML and a JS file, and I can do that live server thing, which looks like it wants to stop first, but is there a live server? Open the live server. Okay. Cool. And this is my website, and I'm going to click fill in results, and boom, I see some results. So what is this website actually? Sorry about the flipping around. It's hard to tell where things are sometimes. Yeah, so first we sent an HTML page, right? And that's all you're ever sending when you send something from the back end to the front end that you want to be seen in a browser. It's always an HTML page. But an HTML page can link things into it. And so in this case, we're linking just a JavaScript file into it, index.js. And initially we show a button that says fill in results, and there's this function it calls called onClickHandler. And then we have this UL that has an ID called results. And then in index.js, I might define some stuff before the handler, but I'm going to explicitly look for that element. And then when the click handler is actually called, we call this function. We're going to look through all of these names that we defined. We're going to create a new element for each one of those names. We're going to set its inner text to that name, and then we're going to append that new element to this container. So far, that's all we've seen in terms of doing front end. I guess I want to open this to the class. How do we feel about this? Like, in terms of doing vanilla JavaScript, does it feel like a good way of doing things? Does it feel cumbersome in some ways? Like, what's your feedback on the experience of doing front end in HTML plus vanilla JavaScript?
Yeah, especially if you're using something like Bootstrap, then you're going to go ahead and find, or at least for me, a lot of the text starts just going everywhere and getting off page and things. And if you don't indent for one block because you're focused on coding, you look back, you realize really quickly, oh, there's a bunch of stuff here that can just get really messy really quick.
Yeah. I mean, I think keyword there, messy. That's it. That's what, like, you can absolutely make a website with just vanilla JavaScript and HTML, including very complex websites. Gmail is notoriously still made in vanilla JavaScript and HTML, and there's a good reason, because it was started as a project so long ago that that's all that was available. And they didn't want to start messing with it once they got it going and they had a good system going on and they solved lots of bugs. Because if you've like invested like 8 years into fixing bugs in a project, you're not going to want to suddenly recreate it in a brand new approach because you'll probably reintroduce those bugs. But yeah, I mean, something feels wrong about it to me, maybe because I've already seen React, but there's something very weird about the fact that if we look here, it's sort of like, this is the source of truth, this HTML page, right? But it's only the source of truth for that first render. And then once it actually renders, we start running some code, and maybe in response to a click, we do something. And first we have to, the JavaScript needs to become aware of the HTML, right? Because it's not automatically. So it has to look for a specific element, and then it creates new elements, it adds things. And what that means is by the end of this callback function running, our DOM looks different than the HTML. And so it's sort of like the source of truth is constantly moving. Every time something changes the page, we change what the underlying data that represents the page looks like. And there's a problem there. This is the problem of all so-called imperative programming, in that if you click this and then you click that and you do this and you do that, after like 20 steps, you're in a place where in order to recreate, like in order to understand what your page currently looks like, you need to know everything that happened beforehand. And that tends to make it hard to debug, because you'll often run into a situation where you're getting some bug and you're like, why is this happening? And then you refresh the page and you try and do the same thing. And there's no bug when you do it that way. It's only because you did this and then that and then that and then that, and trying to figure out exactly what set of actions resulted in the current state right before the bug happened is the essential problem of this approach. It just doesn't scale very well. So that's what we've seen. And I see that I have some stuff here saying like, it can be done relatively well. I'm just sort of repeating what I said, right? But the thing we're trying to shoot for now is this idea that they came up with in like 2013 or something. Even though it had existed for a while before, it's called a single page application. So if I go to a website, and let's say I'm going to try and go to Hacker News, right? Not that I have such a love of Hacker News. I think it's very, it just, you know, it's clickbait. It's always clickbait. But this is a website that you really don't need React for. Like, this website could have gotten all this information from the server, right? And then use some kind of template thing, and then it prints it out, and then this is the website. And it's basically just a set of links. And if I click one of those links, we actually go back to the server or whatever, we follow the link and we go somewhere else. But like if I said comments here, we just went to a different server, or we went to a different route on Y Combinator. We actually talked to the backend, got some new information, and refreshed the page. Compare that to something like, do I dare go to like Twitter live during class? Let's hope nothing happens. So compare it to something like Twitter. I can, what's a good example? Like, notice that when I'm clicking around, we're not actually reloading the page. Stuff on the page is reloading, but we're not reloading the page. And if I were to click like this like button, we don't go to a different page, or we're not talking to a backend, or if we are, it's happening in the background. I'm able to seamlessly change something, and data updates, and I feel, and it is true, that data is updating on the backend somewhere, like this is being recorded. But it's such a seamless experience. This is what we mean by a single page application. A single page application, and as you saw, it just updated for me. That's an example of not a pull, but a push. I didn't do something. The website told, you know, the backend sent a message to me saying, hey, we have a new update for you, 35 new tweets. Cool, the Pope is wearing a great coat. Honestly, he looks excellent. Good old Twitter. Yes, so this is the idea of a single page application, and this is what React aims to help you create, because if one looks at facebook.com, which I'm not going to log into, That's what Facebook.com is. Facebook.com is a single page application. And the key word there is application, and that you are making a website, but websites by default, the technology is to create a poster. And what we want is something more like an app like that exists on your own computer, right? And apps, they respond fast. They work in this way that feels better than a website, or better than an old website, or a Hacker News or Craigslist type of website. And so we're aiming for that experience, which we can technically do with vanilla JavaScript and HTML, but it's just doesn't scale that well because it's not really what those tools were originally intended to help you create. Okay, so we're at React Hello World, and our goal is to create something like this. So in React, or rather, I want to explain why we have to do this. You can't, it's not so easy to just, just like you could just make an HTML page and link a JavaScript page to it and send that to the browser. And that can be like, like we had here, this one folder containing these two files is the entire project. React, unfortunately, is not that simple. And the main reason is because of this thing called JSX. So I don't even know what JSX stands for, but it's essentially just like .js would be a file format, .jsx is another file format. And what it is it's essentially JavaScript, but with HTML supported as a first-class thing in JavaScript. So as you see here, this is an example of a React component. It's literally just a function, but given a certain name. But this is the interesting part. We're able to return HTML. If I try to write HTML in this project here, like I could obviously write it in the HTML part, but if I tried to write here, instead of doing it this way, if I tried to write something like results container dot append, if I just try and write here like li hello, let's see what happens. I'm going to save it, and we're going to attempt to serve it up. Let me actually make this a little bigger so that you can see this. So let me reopen that. I don't think we stopped the server, right? I should not keep doing that. Well, let's just run live server again, but you can probably guess it's not going to work. Well, specifically, we were week 8, day 1. So if we clicked HTML vanilla JS, but as you see, it's not working. And why not? If we read the console log, it's saying, I don't even understand that token. So that's what we expected. You can't write HTML in JavaScript, as far as any of us know. Sorry about all the moving around, but you got to understand things jump around, and you got to have multiple monitors. Okay, so you can't do this in regular JavaScript. You can do this in React, because React uses this thing called JSX. The price of being able to do that is using a set of tools that essentially transform your JSX down to JavaScript. So instead of doing that from scratch, which tends to be pretty difficult, we instead are going to use this thing called Vite. And we want you to follow along while we do this. So we're going to try and create a new Vite project. And I might as well just do it right where I am, or I see them in demos and notes here. So I'm going to create a new Vite project here. I'll just make it at the root level because this is not going to be shared with you guys, but a copy of it exists in week 8, day 1 as the week 8, day 1. It's called example Vite project, but we want you to see us make it, or we want you to make it while we make it. So the first one we're going to do is type npm, which is Node Package Manager, and Node Package Manager can do a fair amount of things. I didn't even know it could do this directly, but it can actually call certain functions it knows about. And so if I say npm create Vite at latest, that should let me create a Vite project. And I want all of you to do this along with me, because I do wonder if it will work, or if it'll say like, oh, you need to download something first, because I already have it downloaded. So can you guys do it and then report back to me what happens when you type that into your terminal? So has anyone successfully typed that in yet?
Yeah, it's asking for a project name.
Yeah, well, if it's asking for the project name, then it worked. It clearly knows what that is. Yeah, so as long as that's working, we're good. So yeah, when we call npm create vite at latest, it's going to use this project called vite or vite or something, which is going to allow us to create a new project. And the first thing it wants to know is the project name. So it's giving us a default, which I'm fine with that. Let's just call it vite project, hit enter. And then it's going to ask you what kind of project you want to create a scaffolding for. So there's a couple technologies out there, but we're going to choose React. And then the next section says select a variant. So technically, if you wanted to do TypeScript, you could choose that. I don't really know what SWC means, but that's clearly a thing some people care about. We're just going to choose regular JavaScript. Cool, and now it is done. So if I type ls, I should see a new folder called Vite project. And as it was telling me here, I want to cd into it. I want to install its dependencies, and then I want to call npm run dev. So cd Vite project, and you guys should do this along with me. You'll see there's some stuff in there. I'm actually going to right now open that in its own thing so that we can look at it explicitly. So we're in the Vite project. The first thing we want to do is npm install. For short, you can write npm I. I don't know if you guys know that. Saves a little time. And npm I is going to go into this packages.json file. It's going to look at everything in dependencies and dev dependencies, and it's going to download all of it into node modules. So node modules just has all of those dependencies and the dependencies of the dependencies, which can be a pretty long list. But that means that we have everything accessible now. And as you see,
Dan, you just asked it in chat, but I was about to ask the same thing as well. Should we be doing this like in a virtual environment like Django? How's the relationship? That sort of
no,
stuff
that's a
work?
great question. Yeah. So the main reason I'm not super familiar with virtual environments is because I haven't worked professionally too much in Python, and there's different sort of solutions to doing dependency stuff. So JavaScript solution is actually pretty simple. It doesn't use any of that virtual environment stuff because all the details are unique to every project. And so every project needs to have its own packages.json, which defines what it relies on, and all that goes in a folder in that project called node modules. But the main difference is that unlike in Python, if you download the exact same dependency for two different projects, it only lives on your hard drive in one place. Whereas with JavaScript's approach, if you have the exact same project, or if you have like 10 projects using the exact same dependency, each one of those projects has a totally unique copy of that dependency. So it's a little more wasteful, but what I like is that you know exactly where it is. As in Python, it's a little harder to know exactly where that dependency has been downloaded. And here it's always in node modules. So if we're looking for React, we can literally find it, React right there. And this is the entire source code of React just plopped right into your code. An important thing to note is because of that, you'll usually have a git ignore file to say we don't want to record these files when we push to git, and node modules should always be in that folder. Otherwise, like 95% of the size of your project will live in node modules, and you don't want to share node modules. You want to have people just write npm install when they clone your project. Any other questions? Because that was a good question. So we should so yeah, no virtual environment, no more worrying about virtual environment. And I see Daniel's asking about folder structure. We can talk about that, but for right now, let's just look at what Vite gave us automatically. So it gives us this thing called vite.config, which I don't know too much about. We don't need to know too much about. But as we could see, it's sort of modifying things so that it knows it's working with React. And then package.json is going to have our dependencies. And then importantly, it also has our scripts. So if we want to run this, we can write npm run dev. And that's a script that's just going to call Vite. And then if I go to that site, I'm actually seeing a running site. And then we can look at what source code actually produced this site. Sorry about all the jumping around. It jumps around on you. It's kind of nuts. Where were we? Let's just, right, we're gonna move this here. Okay, so what did we actually get? Well, we also have package lock. You generally don't need to worry about that, but package lock is a way that basically, if you're doing stuff with like Git, two people's versions of package.json can get out of date, and package lock is almost like a history of everything that's ever been done with your package.json. As you can see, it's very long and confusing. Most people don't read it, and you generally shouldn't modify it yourself. Rather, you modify package.json, and it will automatically modify package.lock. We don't really need to worry about it. Then there's index.html. As you see here, this is a normal HTML page. It's, pulling in some links, but importantly, it has this div ID equal to root and then a script at the very end calling source main.jsx. And then if we look there, we see, so first we do see this public folder, which is allowing us to serve up /byte.svg, but we won't really use that. That's just sort of a convenience thing they're giving you, which is sort of like a fake little backend if you wanted to serve some stuff while making your front end site. But ultimately, anything in public would want to eventually live on the back end. But everything that's truly on the front end is in source. And as you see, we have this div ID root, right? And then we have source main.jsx. So if we look in source main.jsx, what is it? We're finally seeing some React. So the first thing React does is it's going to use this library called React DOM, call a function called create root. The root we give it is that actual element in the HTML. So right here, it's going to know about this element in HTML now. And then we say dot render. This is now, what React calls components. So we don't really need to worry about the strict mode thing. That's just to give you certain wordings, but we're going to render this thing called app. And this is the only time you're ever going to see this. But basically what we're doing is connecting JavaScript to HTML, because we're saying that this ID here called a root represents our React page now. And every time we want to render our application or something changes in it, that's where it renders. Cool. And then you might also see we have this import /index.css. So that's just a feature you get as part of this modern version of front-end tooling where you can just import CSS directly into a project. So this is some CSS. You don't have to do it in the HTML. And as you can kind of see, we're trying to get to a point in React where we're barely thinking about the HTML. We're thinking about everything in terms of JavaScript. So yeah, this defines, this sort of bootstraps our React stuff. And we're going to talk more about this when we get into it, but this is just to get our hello world going. And I'm just going to take out this CSS for now, because I don't want to add anything in that we don't need to see. So I'm taking that out. And as you'll see, all that should change is some of the styling. And what else? Well, we're finally going to get here, or rather, app over here is imported from app. And when we go here, we'll see at the very bottom, we export default app. So that's the common pattern. And app here represents our React page. And again, I don't want to go too into it because there's a bunch of features here you probably haven't seen yet because you haven't seen anything. But I'm just going to get rid of all of this. And I'm going to get rid of this. And I'm going to get rid of virtually everything in here, right? Or actually all of it. And then I'm just going to say something like return h1 hello world and save it. And then when I go back here, that's what I see. So that is our hello world for React. And I want to make sure that as many of you as possible can actually do this yourself right now. And if not, we want to take questions. So I don't think it's worth creating a poll. But yeah, let's spend a minute or something, a minute or two doing this. And if anyone wants to volunteer to walk through it, if they're having like issues, let's do that, because we want to get to a point where we have like a scratch pad, basically. Because I don't expect you to understand how Vite works, but I do want to be in a position where we could just start creating some React components and see them on screen. Okay, I see one thumbs up. Any more thumbs up? I see, there we go. There we go. Cool, so we got some thumbs up and that's cool. And while we haven't really talked about it yet, we've gotten to a point now where, I mean, I don't know, this either seems like a small deal or a big deal, but it kind of is a big deal in that we now have made it so we don't need to think about HTML anymore. We can write all of our HTML within our JavaScript, and that makes it really easy now that if I have like an on click, right? Before I had to, have a separate file, and we had like on click lowercase importantly, and then I did something like this, right? Where I said like handle on click, and that has to like live somewhere, and we don't have to do that anymore. Now we can do something much simpler, or what I consider much simpler. We just write that function handle on click. It's a function, and let's say it takes nothing, and we're just going to say, because it knows about the browser, we're going to say alert hello in response to being clicked. And then we'll explain this in a bit, but now I don't have to reference it by name or anything like that. I literally do this. These curly braces in React stand for, you can write JavaScript in here. So like this, I just say, boom, that function, which is, so basically our HTML or JSX and our JavaScript are speaking the exact same language. So to me, this is much simpler than that. Yeah. Is someone talking on purpose? What I actually do here, I said this H1, when you click it, something happens. Maybe you can't even do that. Maybe that's invalid in that handler. Good point. Oh, right. Yeah, that was one thing to point out. Things do change in React sometimes, and we will get into this, but what is called on click in the normal world of vanilla JavaScript is now called on click in, with the camel case in React. And that's just so that React doesn't, basically React wants to be careful to not conflict with existing things. So you'll also see that often in React, you don't say class equals, my class. Instead, you'll say class name. So there's often little things like that. But let's see this. I have this H1, I click it, we got our alert, great. So that's just a little preview. But yeah, basically everything you know about HTML is now perfectly accessible. Just writing it directly in React. You can do this if you want to write a bunch more. Like if we wanted to put it all in a div or something. But for the rest of class, we're basically going to get into how you make React sort of a full solution for replacing HTML without adding anything new yet, or something that HTML can't do yet.
I have a question actually.
Yes.
How were you able to launch it in the browser?
So I launched it for this. I launched it in the browser using Vite. So I'm going to exit this, right? And so you'll see here we have package.json, and package.json will usually have a thing called scripts. And one of those scripts is called dev. So if a script is called start, you can just write npm start. But for anything else, you write npm run and then the name of that script. So if I write dev here, writing all this is the equivalent of writing Vite. But if I wrote Vite, my computer doesn't know about Vite because it's unique to this project. So when I write this, it will run something called Vite that it knows about because it has a dependency, a dev dependency called Vite. And when I do that, that's going to spin up a server that allows me to, click right here and go to that site.
Okay.
Yeah. And as long as we use Vite, that's how we will do it. Then I'm going to control C to get out of it. And yeah, while we're here, we might as well show this too. You'll notice there's a script called build. So what happens if I write npm run build? Okay, it says it's building some stuff, and then it created this new folder called dist. So notice this, when we write React, we can have it in so many files. We can do whatever we want, but that's essentially like source code. And we want to compile that source code eventually for the sake of serving it up. And what writing npm run or build does, even though you won't do this anytime soon, that packages everything up. So now you have this folder that contains your HTML file. And it's able to point to, certain resources, maybe like this vite.svg, or it can point to, importantly, a big JavaScript file that took everything you cared about and compiled it to like ugly JavaScript that's small. So like all of React is contained in here. It's just hard to read. And while you'll never really look at it like this, it's important to note just that even though we're going to be writing stuff in React and using Vite, it's one push to turn that into just HTML, just JavaScript that any browser can understand. So we're not actually locking ourselves out of like old browsers, for example. React is just a language, or really a library that we write things in, or JSX is the language, we write things in it. And then eventually, using this sort of heavy tooling, we compile it or transpile it to something that the browser will understand. But we don't need to worry too much about the sort of the how of it right now. We're just going to be worried for the rest of this class. How do we work in React? How do we get the most out of React? Cool. Any other questions right now?
So kind of more of an industry related question. So is it more common to see this sort of HTML rendering versus something like, well, I guess Django would be a bad example, but is it kind of more common to see this kind of rendering instead of making multiple index pages with their own attributes and then having those run through something like Django?
In the modern day, yes. So it sounds like what you're saying is like an alternative is Django templates. Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah, another different use cases for each, but I'm just kind of curious about the more general sense.
Yeah, well, basically there's different approaches, but the React approach is nice because, as you'll see, we can build as many, by the time we're done with the full React thing, you'll see you can build as many pages as you want to React, as many components as you want to React. It can be thousands upon thousands of files. But at the end of the day, you're going to be able to run some kind of build thing that just produces either one file or sometimes multiple files if that's more efficient. But essentially, it's we will be writing multiple files. We're just going to be doing it slightly differently than Django templates. So we don't need to put it all in one file for ourselves, even though it will eventually all live in one file for the sake of serving it.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, this image here is supposed to, I guess I have my page resources a little messed up, but wonder why that doesn't work. It's really not there. Okay. But that was just to show you the page of Vite, its main page working. And I see here we're everything I just talked about, we're talking about here a little bit. So what do we have here? Yeah, we break it down a little, but the main point is that you had that div with ID of root. Like that's the main thing to learn here. Just that we do have an HTML page. It's very minimal, but it has something with an ID of root. And then our main JavaScript thing, which we of course, actually kick off from our HTML, that main bit of JavaScript grabs that root and then renders our React app in it. And then everything else is just React. So right, as long as we can make something like this and render it to the screen, that is good. And I see I even wrote it here that this would be a good time to break. So let's do a 15-minute break starting now. We'll come back at 10 a.m. CST, and then we'll, from there, start talking about how to actually work in React. Yep, so I'll see you all in 15 minutes. I'll check out the chat. Zoom recording, share my screen. I saw in the chat there that Daniel had a question about what the @latest does. My guess is that that @latest could probably be replaced with like a specific version, and @latest just gets you the latest stable version. That's only really I do wonder if you just left off at latest entirely, what it would do. It'd probably still do at latest. But that shouldn't be too much of a concern, version numbers, until like in the real world, it does matter because often for compatibility's sake, you have to like freeze it. But for learning, we just want the latest. Okay, good to know. It works without the at latest. Good to know. I just copy pasted that from Veet's own site. Cool. So we're going to spend the next hour. That's the plan, hopefully, to look into intro to React. And this is really, I mean, I want to spend as much time on this as we can, because this is really the bread and butter of like what React is, and just to understand what kind of direction we're trying to set for ourselves. We've seen here, for example, I could have something like ./myComponent.jsx. Let me copy paste this, and I'm going to put it inside of my app folder here. So you see I have app here. I just moved that export default up here. But I can have more than one component defined in a file. It's not going to like two export defaults, but I could have this thing called my component, and then even though they're defined in a different order, I should be able to write my component like this and hit save. And if I look at it, a little hard to see because it's coming from over here because it's a marquee, but that works. So this is a component just as much as this is a component, and one component can reference another component. And as you can see, while a component looks like this, when we define it, it's just a function. We can use it as if it's HTML, like so. And what we see here is just saying this is a self-closing thing. So you might, you've seen in normal HTML, you might have something like image, and image has like a source, but there's nothing inside of image, it just ends. Well, that works, but in JSX, they like to be explicit and say that if it's self-closing, if there's no body to it, there's nothing inside of it, you end it with a slash caret, whatever. Okay, so we have our component here, and as you can see, a component produces HTML. So or rather returns HTML. So our goal here ultimately is to see if we can get all the features HTML has in React, because if we were writing HTML, we see basically, we have something like, what is that doc type thing I've seen? Does it have to be an HTML file to do that? Well, I think I could just set that here, HTML, and then I do that, and then it understands, cool. So if I'm in an HTML file, I could say like, div, and then in that div, an H1, and in that H1 some text like hello, and then still at that same level we have a UL, and we have multiple LIs, right? And each one could have some content. So basically there's at least 3 features we care about in order to get the full power of HTML, because what we're trying to do with React is define our own HTML elements. So of the features we want to make sure that we get, I'm doing there. So basically there's a couple features that we see in HTML that make it a powerful approach to modeling a UI, and we want to make sure we get all those in React. So what are some features in HTML? If that's not too open-ended of a question, what are some features we get with HTML that help us create a UI or think about or like model a UI?
Buttons.
What was that?
Buttons.
Buttons, yeah. Well, that's true. We do have certain, so we have built-ins. That is actually very true. We have built-ins like button. But if we get a little more abstract, we can say like, okay, we have a built-in like button, right? But what is a button? Well, first, it's an element. We can define an element, right? And then a button can actually take inner content. So sometimes inner content can be a lot. Like in this div, we have a lot of things in the inner content. Sometimes it's just text. But this button can take inner content. And then importantly, it also can do something like this, where we say button on click, equals do something, and that has to live somewhere. But basically, we kind of have this basic API with HTML, which says, okay, well, you have elements. Elements can be self-closing sometimes, like with this image, or they can be explicitly closed because they have something in the body. So elements can be nested in each other. That's an important feature. And then we have attributes like source or on click, so we can provide more specific functionality to that element. So our goal in React is to get all of those features, attributes and nesting, and whatever other features HTML can have. But we want to make it so that we can just make our own arbitrary HTML elements, because right now, everything we have to do is image and button. And let's say I said like, oh, I always have this thing called a profile, right? And a profile is always going to be like, an H1, with a person's name and then their image, let's say, and then a button for whatever reason. And let's say I say, okay, I have a profile called this. So maybe with Django templates, you can make that happen. But with raw HTML, if you have this idea of, oh, every profile is going to look like this, you just have to copy and paste it over and over again. Wouldn't it be nice if we could say, I have this whole bit of HTML that looks like this, and that's actually equivalent to some new HTML I'm defining called profile. And profile is going to result in something like this. And maybe even you can pass it an image, right? Like maybe just like the image has a source, maybe I could pass the source like, like this into my profile. And then that is exactly what shows up here. So maybe I passed it in like this, and then it shows up here. Maybe I even passed in the name or something, right? And so this is what we're shooting for, which is basically, we're going to be able to have a component which is ultimately just replaced with HTML, but this component is not only has its own name, but it can take arguments. Maybe it has a body, and we're going to see how we can get all those features of what already exists in HTML within React. Cool. So the first point we have here is, we created this new component, and then we're referencing it in app, and maybe I'll have something like this. So I do want to show you that while in this case I'm returning a single element, and same over here. If I wanted to return more than one element, well, I still have to return a single element. But if I have a lot, I can wrap it in parentheses like this. So you'll see that a lot. And then importantly, you see here, we're saying export default function app, and we're doing that because main needs to import app, right? So we kind of like to use that pattern and not have more than one function in a file. So the very common pattern you'll see is, main is going to be like what Bootstrap's thing, app is sort of the root of your folder, and then every other component you have is going to go in a folder at this level called components. And let me copy paste this, or I'm just calling it my component. So in here, I'm going to create a new file called my component.jsx. And then I define it in here. And if I want at the bottom, I can say export default my component, and that works. But I personally prefer to just move that export default in front of the function, and that also works. So this is now my entire function definition. And then from app, I can now say, if I try and compile this, it's not going to understand what my component is. So if I save this and I run it, you'll see we don't see anything. And if I look in the inspector, it's going to give us some errors, but importantly, my component is not defined, which is true because we have to say import my component. And look, it's actually going to be self-aware. I just hit tab. It knows what I'm talking about. That's the default thing. And now I do have access to this component. I come here and we see it. Reload to get rid of those errors. There it is. Okay, so that's the first thing we wanted to show you, that components can be defined outside of the app file, and they can be pulled in using import export syntax. So we're gonna try and stick to one component to one file. And yeah, let's just see that, right here we have this, this represents our project, and the way this works, it looks like, okay, we should get that element root that's in the HTML. So we get this element here, and then we don't need to worry about this, but basically we're rendering app there. And what does app look like? Well, app looks like this, and this again gets replaced with other stuff. And we would expect to just see the HTML when it's finally rendered. And that is the case, that if I look inside the body, we see that div ID of root, but it's not empty anymore. It has stuff in it, and that stuff is whatever was at the root of app, and that includes all, replacements. So really, so far, we just have a means of creating HTML in a way that's a bit more modular than we could normally do, which is good. And you'll notice a good feature of it is that I had that my component, right? Well, I haven't really made it so unique, but I could have like 3 of these in a row. And because I created a brand new type of component, there's no problem there. I now have 3 different things. If I reload it, they'll all show up at the same time. But I have 3 different components that are totally separate from each other. So if I were to grab this while it's moving, even though we're just doing this in the DOM, if I were to edit, this one right here, will it work if I just, yeah, if I edit this one right here, it changes. And it's because they're totally independent from each other. They're just means of, you could think of my component here, even though it looks like an HTML tag, it's ultimately just calling a function and being replaced with HTML. Okay, so we have our basic idea of like how to create a function. Any questions so far? Just creating functions, importing functions, or rather components, importing them, exporting them, defining them in a basic way. I'm going to check the chat quickly. Okay, based on the no feedback, I'm going to assume we're okay with that for now. I did say here, let's practice for like a minute. We might as well, everyone just create your own component and reference in an app. So basically just create your own component in like a components folder, import it like this, call it like this, and then define it however you want, just an H1, anything else that is raw HTML that it understands. Just try it out, because you want to see your own code rendered to the screen, and then you have a working, scratchpad type environment. Okay, so I'll let you all do that. No need to show it or anything. You just want to see it's working. And if it's not, please do interrupt and say something, because we want to see if it's not working, why it's not working, because other people will probably have the same issue. Okay, so let's say I created something called profile. I use this a lot to show the example. So I'm going to create a new thing called profile. So if I want to create this element and call it an app, does anyone want to volunteer to tell me what are the steps? Like, I have this code here. If I want to create a new component, let's say we don't even have that code. If I want to create a new component, what's my first step?
Make a new file in the components folder.
Exactly. So
I
we're
guess you
gonna create
could
a new
stack
file.
them in one file, but might get sloppy.
Exactly. Yeah. So we like to create a file per component, and we're going to create a new file, and we're generally going to give it the exact name of that component. So in this case, that component was going to be called profile. So we'll say profile.jsx. And you'll notice this is just a convention, but to distinguish between normal HTML and a component you made yourself or that you got from a library, React components are generally going to be capital case, whatever you call it, first letter capital, as if it's like a proper name. Cool. So we created profile, and ultimately all a component is a function. So I'm going to create a function like this, and I'm going to name that function profile, and I'm going to give it an empty parameter list and open it up. And what should I do in here?
You return JSX.
Exactly. So we could theoretically do something above it, but ultimately we want to return some JSX, aka, you know, HTML like stuff. And I just have something here, so I'm going to grab it. Okay, so this is, you know, what it's going to look like. We're returning a div with an H2 and an image. It's just a random placeholder image site. And notice I also added this export default here. The export default is going to make it so that when we try and import this file, this will be the default thing it imports. Okay, so first let's see it working. Well, we can't see it yet because we haven't imported it. So what is the next step to actually see this? So we
You
are,
have to import it into the component and then use it and call it.
exactly. So I'm going to import it. It knows about it. And now because app is the only thing actually getting rendered ever, I import it to app. And of course, if I imported it to something below app, as long as it's eventually getting imported, it's fine. But yeah, so I can just create a profile like so. And this is an example of the profile. And just to show, we'll make 3 of them. Why not? We'll save it. And cool. Now we have 3 things representing users. So that is our first, meaningful component. Feel good about that.
So real quick, following along, I didn't, on that right there on mine, I initially didn't have it wrapped in a div. I was just trying to return just the component.
Mhm.
And it was basically complaining, saying it has to have a parent compartment or whatever, parent container.
Yes, you're
Does it
saying you have, like,
matter?
multiple profiles in a row.
No, I just returned one component without the div, without the H1, and it was like not happy.
Really?
Why does it need a?
As far as I'm concerned, this should work. This should work.
Yeah, it wasn't.
Okay,
It was
so
weird.
seems like it's working for me. If you want to share your screen, it could be useful to try and debug it in real time.
Well, I fixed it now, but let me see. 1 second here.
We will be getting to that. While it seems like something maybe you should be able to do, you can't do this. If I just have 2 things in a row like this, you'll see it. It gives me, squiggles. And if I hover
Yeah,
over
that's
that,
what
it
I'm
says-
looking at right there. It was 2
Okay,
things.
so this is the most common beginner error you'll see in a React project. JSX expressions must have one parent element. Basically what it's saying is it can't just return 2 top level things. You have to wrap them at the very least in something like a div. And then that error will go away because you're always returning one element. It doesn't understand what you mean if you're returning multiple elements at the same time. Maybe it should, but it doesn't.
Gotcha. Okay, that
Very,
explains it.
very soon we'll learn a way that you don't even have to use the div. So, okay, so we have our profile here. Ignore this example because I'm realizing this is a recursive definition. Oh, never mind. No, never mind. This is an app, right? So this is all good. And this is, if it's multiple lines, we wrap it like that with the parentheses. And we just wanted to point out that, once again, that in React, you can't just have a self-closing thing close just like this. Like if I do this, React is going to complain and not understand it because it needs it to be explicitly self-closed, which I like actually, because at a glance, you can always tell now if something is closed or not. Okay, so this is the issue that we just talked about. And it's the idea that adjacent JSX elements must be wrapped in an enclosing tag. So we saw that one way to solve it was to wrap it in a div. And yeah, so right here we have this profile, it's in a div. And if I look for it, I see that, here's my div ID root. Here's my div that represents the whole thing. And then each one of these profiles, according to our definition, is wrapped in a div. So this div represents the whole profile, just like this div represents the whole profile, and that's fine. But you could see how that solution could produce lots and lots of divs, and you're just wrapping everything in divs, and maybe a div isn't exactly what you want, and maybe you want nothing, and you should be able to do that, right? So there is a pretty simple solution. React includes something called a fragment. So we're going to import from React. And what are we going to import from React? Well, there's lots of things in there. For example, fragment. You actually don't have to do it that way. You could just write import, React from React. And then in here, instead of writing a div, I could say react.fragment. And I have to close that. And now let's save this. And what you'll notice is that if I look at the HTML, now let me just reload to make sure. I still have that div ID root. I still have the div representing the whole app, but each one of these is actually at the root. It's not wrapped in a div. So fragment is a way to package everything up into one single element. But at the end of the day, it's not going to be a rendered element. So that's your solution for wrapping multiple elements at once. And it's so common and useful that you often don't see this. You don't see people wrap, explicitly importing React and calling React fragment. Instead, they do this. Just take React fragment out of both of those places. And this empty opener and empty closer represents React.fragment. So you'll see again, this still works. And if I inspect it, it's just at that top level, like they're just right next to each other. They're not actually wrapped in their own div. So that's one of these many things that, which is why I want to give so much time to talking about these basic ideas that there's just a lot of little things to know in React to be productive in it, like the fragment, for example, and that error. Everyone sees that error constantly until they get used to the idea that you can't just return 2 or 3 elements at once. So any questions so far about, creating a basic functional component or using this fragment thing to wrap multiple elements? Yeah, so so far so good, I think. So we showed that shorthand there, and then okay, now we're going to get to the topic that actually makes React more powerful than, we're going to upgrade a level of power now. So far, what we've seen is that we can represent, so if we look at app, we can represent a bit of HTML as a component. And that component is defined as a function. That function takes no arguments and simply returns some HTML, right? So one simple upgrade you could think of was, well, what if this function did take arguments of some kind? Then what it returned could be specific to those arguments. This is where the idea of props comes in. So you see here, I have my profile and it returns some HTML. But what I'm contrasting it to is something like image here. So if we look at just image here, image takes an attribute, right? And an attribute is kind of like a named parameter for a function. So React recognizes that's exactly what an attribute is. It's a set of key value pairs matching a name to a value, and that value is passed to that element. So in the case of our profile, what we're going to do is we take the profile as it exists and we give it an argument called props. This is the only argument your component takes, one argument, and it's called props. And let's just print that out, console.log props. Cool. And if you notice here, I'm going to go back to profile. I'm not changing anything. So in order to get this props, you don't do anything. It's already there. So let's run it and see what happens. So I'm going to reload. And you'll see that it, we're printing these 2 elements. And because of the console.log, we're actually printing this object twice, but the object called props is empty. You'll actually notice it's printing it 4 times, not 2 times. The reason for that is because you saw here this, it's not really so important for you guys to know, but React strict mode, one of the things it does is it renders everything twice, not just once. And the reason is that allows you to catch subtle bugs. Basically, there are some times where only rendering something once, you won't see an issue, but if you render it twice, you will. And so that's just a little thing they do. You don't really need to worry about it. Your console will just always show double of every statement. But right, so we're printing these two profiles, and each one of those profiles is getting a props object, and we're printing it, but it's empty, right? Well, we can start filling that props object in. So I could say, like, actually, you know, my profile takes a name, and that name is equal to Ben. And how about this profile also takes a name, but that name is equal to Charlie. We're going to save. We're going to look over here. Cool. One of them is actually printing name and the other is printing Charlie. So they're actually getting that info. And because it's, you know, a parameter, it can be different for each one. And let's just leave it at that for now. We just have name, right? So how do we use that? Well, if we go to profile here, we're just getting props, but props has something on it now. So instead of just writing, well, I mean, first things first, I can just write console.log props.name, and that would indeed print it. So if I look here, I'm seeing Ben and Charlie for each one of those. But we don't just want to print it. We actually want to include it in our HTML. And as we mentioned earlier, but only passingly, there's this idea in React called the React escape sequence. So just like in string interpolation, you know how you can say, like, so let's say I have this props.name, right? Well, I could define my own string where I could say const, you know, my string equals, and I can do this, and I can say, hello, my name is, and then I give it this little thing here, this little device that says, actually, for this part of the string, we're not a string anymore. We want you to interpret this as regular JavaScript. So first, if I do that, I can say console.log my string, and indeed, that's what we print. So the question is, how do we do a similar thing in React? Well, React does it basically just about the same. It just doesn't use a $sign. So in React itself, or rather in the JSX part of React, you know, the HTML part that we return, I can remove this username. And if I were to write props.name just like that, what do we think happens? Well, it's just HTML. So those are just words. Those are just letters. So it's just going to write props.name. But now if we wrap that in these little curly braces, React understands, oh, for that little section, you actually want to write, you know, JavaScript. And so now if I write props.name here, we see the actual name we passed in. And just so you can see, it can be anything. So if I, you know, just create a random H1 here and I open those curly braces, I could write 1 + 1 times, you know, I don't even know what JavaScript will do with this, but it'll do something. 1 + 1 times hello. Not a number, cool. But the point is you can put any JavaScript in there with the exception of a statement. So you can't put something like if, you know, true, you know, if I try to write if true, you know, I don't even know, hello or return hello, this will not work. I wonder what error it gives me. It says expression expected. So the reason this doesn't work is because what happens when I run if true return hello? Well, it'll return hello, but that is a statement, not an expression. And JavaScript or this escape sequence thing can't understand that. So the solution is just we don't write an if statement, we'll write a ternary statement. So we can say instead something like, you know, true. If true, then hello, otherwise, you know, goodbye. And now if I look here, yeah, that works. And similarly, if I change this to false, it understands. So we're getting a little ahead of ourselves because we do cover this explicitly, but like all JavaScript works in there. It's just that you don't want to use statements because statements don't return anything. So we always use expressions, and there's always an expression version of whatever you want. So we will get to that. But the important point to see is that we were able to pass in stuff with props and then be explicit about what we can then use the props using the escape sequence. So the props plus the escape sequence now lets us fill in the details for each one. And maybe like this is a certain API that lets me put different values here. So this is 600 by 400, but it could be something else. So I could similarly say like, okay, well, here's my profile named Ben, and ultimately I'm going to give the image a source. So I'm going to call this image source, and I'm going to make this one equal to this. Just clean that up a little. And then similarly, I'll do the same thing here, but I'll give it a new value. It's now going to be, 300 by 200. It's going to be half the size. And then once again, I go to profile, and now I have something called image source. I can replace this. So even though this is an attribute, similarly, I can just go like that and say props.image source. And I save that and I look, and exactly. So you can already see how we're getting so much more power than what HTML normally gave us, because now we can make our own elements. And it's not more complicated than a normal function. We just give it some input and use that input to create an output. We're not doing anything fancy yet, but we're getting way more power than we had with raw HTML. And even though we could do all this with HTML plus vanilla JS, it was real finicky. You had to be very explicit about how it worked. So this is just giving us a nice abstraction in the form of a function. And the final thing to talk about here is, we'll take questions in a second. I'm doing it this way, right? Where I'm grabbing each thing off of props. But it's kind of a little annoying because who knows what's on props? The only way to know is to actually look here. So something that's pretty common is first, you can destructure props within the body. So I could say something like this: const, object equals props. And then inside of there, I could say, well, I'm grabbing something called name off of it, and I'm grabbing something called image source. And this is useful in part because you might have way too many props on there and you only care about some. So I can write that now, and that will work. You can't see any difference, but it's the same. And even better than that, why even do it like this? You can destructure something within the parameter itself. So instead of naming the parameter props, we can just do that. And this is now the most common pattern you'll see, where we have per file, we have exactly one component. We export default that one functional component, and then it takes one argument, but we destructure that argument to be all the props it might take, and then we use that to produce our component. And it's still the same thing. Cool. So let's stop here to ask questions, because now that we've introduced props, we have about as much power as we can have. Like, we're basically there. We basically can make our own HTML elements and make them do anything. So any questions about this part of it, or what we've gotten up to so far? Not hearing any questions, and I'm trying to figure out how. Oh, there's the chat thing. No, nothing in the chat. So no questions so far. We all feel happy with this idea that a component is a function, and that component takes the equivalent of attributes. We just call them props now, and those props are the inputs to that function. Because that's all it is right now. Basically, we're using the structure of a function to represent a new HTML element. Cool. Yeah, so that is looking pretty good to me right now. I'm going to look back at the notes and let's see what is next. So yeah, props is just this single argument. And we'll see, if we print out the props, we'll see we're just getting a list of all the things you named as arguments in your like attributes for your components. So right, this is exactly what it would be. We've covered all this. The one thing we haven't seen yet is props.children. So in order to be a full HTML replacement, we're missing one thing. And that one thing is, you notice how div has stuff inside of it? Well, in HTML, div, if you were to look in the DOM, div as an element, or this div as an element, knows it has something called inner HTML. So if I'm going to look here, I'll look at this div, right? If I'm going to actually like look at this div, how do I know there's a way to do that. Like I want to look at everything inside of this div. Properties, maybe? Yeah, exactly. So this is everything this div element in the DOM is aware of. And one important thing it has is inner HTML, because it is self-aware of what's inside of it. Well, React is exactly the same. We just haven't noticed it yet because in addition to the props we can directly provide it, there's a lot of props that it already knows about. So for example, in profile here, let's say I said, well, actually this, a profile could just be a profile, but that profile could actually have something inside of it. So let's say this second one here, we're going to say, okay, it's a profile. It's not self-closing. We're going to close it like this. And the reason we're doing that is we want to put something inside of it. We want to say that actually profiles can have, children that they are self-aware of. So let's say we just have a marquee because literally this semester I discovered marquee because someone introduced it in a example, and I think it's very fun. I don't know why I've never heard of marquee before, but in marquee we'll just say hello world, whatever. So without changing anything, nothing changes here. We're not using this child at all. But if I look inside of my profile thing, I can say, okay, well, it takes name and image source, but there's actually some things just built in. And one of them is something called children. So props.children is something it's going to be aware of. And what that means is I can actually say, well, at the very least, first, just to show it, I can just print it. So up here, I can just say console.log children. And what do we see? Let's look at our example. Well, in one case, it was undefined because that first one, we didn't pass anything called, like in this first example, there are no children. So that's going to, the value of children for this one is going to be undefined. But for this one, it should have a value. And what is that value? Well, it looks kind of complicated. It's a React element of type marquee, but this is hard to read. We don't think about it in this way. So any ideas? What do we want to do if we want to see this marquee element? What might we want to do here? How do I add this marquee element to the page that's passed in as, a child? Any takers? It's something you've already seen. It's on the page even.
I mean, you should be able to just do like curly brackets with children instead of it.
Exactly. So if what is passed into children is a React element, it'll work. We just write children like that, and that works. So now you'll see, it's over here, which is, a little annoying, but that it's just right there now. And noticeably for this one, it was fine with it being undefined. So if there's nothing in children and you try and, write children, as long as it's undefined or null, React treats that as nothing. But if there's something there, it will render it. And of course, I can make it different per thing. So, I have hello world here, but in here, maybe I have, a bit more. Maybe I have, the marquee in here, but it says goodbye world. And maybe I just have way more in there. Like I have a div with an H1. Hello, goodbye. Doesn't really matter. The point is that children is going to map to everything inside. So all of this should be on the page now. Our goodbye world, our hello, goodbye. So now that we've introduced props.children, we have everything we need to make HTML our own. We don't have to just use these elements that have been predefined. Those elements that have been predefined are still our lowest level elements. Everything ultimately boils down to those. But now we have a really easy means of creating our own HTML elements. And it's sort of nuts that that didn't happen for like at least 20 years, maybe more. Like all people had for the longest time was HTML, and no one ever successfully found a way to make your own HTML elements. And there were all these different movements to try and do it, but they often faltered. And React pulled it off. And the way it pulled it off was by moving HTML into JavaScript, which might seem normal now, but it was like when they first started doing it, a lot of pushback. But cool, we're making our own elements. You know, I'm happy with that. And let's see if there's anything we left out.
Hey, Ben, I just had a quick question.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I'm just thinking about how this all ties in with everything we did with Django. And essentially, once we learn React, we don't have to worry about the templates because I was struggling personally about by using the HTML files there. But if I can just do it all in React, wouldn't that be essentially what you're trying to accomplish here?
Yeah, exactly. So that is the thing about web development, and I'm sure other industries have this too, is new things come out over time, and sometimes they overlap in certain ways, and sometimes they just totally replace something else. You should know about templates because old projects will use it. Very few modern projects, and even projects in the last 5 years, generally not using templates at all. Instead, the modern way is you serve up like your entire front end is a single HTML page, and it's real simple. It just looks like this. And then you just pull in your entire React app, and your React app could be gigantic. And we're going to get to that by like day 4, I think, where your React app could have routes. Your React app could have so much going on, and it's still just a single page. And so, yeah, you may see templates in your life still, but React is a total replacement for doing things with templates. And you can kind of see the evolution where templates give you a little bit of conditional logic, a little bit of looping logic. But at the end of the day, HTML is not a programming language, or not a Turing complete programming language. And so it doesn't feel like enough. It gives you a little, but you kind of want a full programming language to manipulate your HTML as much as possible. React is that solution. It's an evolution of templates, basically.
Got it. Thank you.
Cool. Any other questions about what we've covered so far?
Yeah, how would we target a specific child of children? Like, can we target just that H1 that says hello, goodbye?
Not exactly. For what reason? Like, just because, like, you ultimately can, but it's something of an advanced topic. But tell me what it is you might want to accomplish.
Nothing specific. It's just that you may not want all of those things at once.
Yeah.
So
I think in that case, the best way to do that would be, instead of using children, and this is kind of fun that we can just see this. Let's just try this out. Like, let's say we didn't want to do this children thing, but we did want to say, hey, sometimes we give it an H1 and we do something with that H1. Well, I'm pretty sure this works just as well, where I can say like, I could say something like, you know, H1 component equal to, and I could just pass some JSX right there. Seems fine with it so far. And then on the inside, I should be able to access something called, let's X that out. I should be able to access something called H1 component, which notably was not on the other one. So we got to be careful with that. But from there, I could just say like, okay, well, this is where I put my H1 component. And then I can modify that or the behavior of that as much as I wanted. So generally, when you're using children, you're saying, hey, there's all this stuff in here, but I'm not really aware of how it works. I can't manipulate it too much. Whereas with this approach, you can manipulate it a lot more. So for example, like I'm saying, yeah, I mean, I will say this is a good enough solution, but it really depends on what you're trying to do. The important point is that you always have this thing called props. You always have props.children. There's ways of doing it. And in general, the kind of the general sort of rule in React is if something's getting too complicated, make it its own component. So there's nothing stopping us from making a unique component to handle whatever logic we want for that specific element. Yeah, hopefully that's a good enough answer for now.
yeah, that statement right there, if it's getting complicated, make it its own. That's good.
Yeah, and I will say that it's not always obvious what the best way to do it is, but there's an answer for everything. So there's kind of an elegant way to do everything in React, whatever that might be, but it will depend on the individual thing. Cool. Any other questions about what we've seen so far before we move? I see I have like 15 minutes left, so for this section, so maybe I should keep moving. But any questions? All right. So we've covered this now, making it aware of its body. We've covered this. This is the destructuring thing, which I like. Just some things to point out, like we've covered this a little, but basically, just like children, you have some props that are built in. So if I'm looking at a div, for example, or an H2, every single element is going to have this thing called class name. It's not called class because they don't want to conflict with regular HTML, but even though I don't have any CSS to match up with this, I can just write hello. And then if I look over here and I reload, if I were to look at that, where did we put it? We put it on the H2. So if I were to look right here, I'll see I actually have class here equal to hello. And that's one way that I could hook it up to CSS. So that's class name for you. And there's a bunch of other built-ins, way too many for us to list up front. But another one we could have is on click. So every element's capable, as you see, there's, if you start typing on, there's so many things it supports that, overwrite some functionality built into normal HTML elements. But if I say on click, it knows about that. And notably, I'm not writing on click with a lowercase c because that's how regular HTML does it. So instead we say on click, so React is aware. And then on click, we could literally just write a function in line like this and say, alert hello. And that's another built-in. So now when I click on this H2, we see hello. But of course, if I click here, nothing because we didn't define an on click for that. Yeah. Okay, so covered a few things now. We've covered these built-in props, class name on click. So some things to note first, this whole space before the return, you can write any JavaScript there. It's just a regular JavaScript function. So before you get to the return part, you can put anything there, including defining functions, including just about anything. Like it's just a regular space to write regular JavaScript. So if you need to do pre-processing, whatever it is, you want to print something in the console, you do it before the return statement. And yeah, just to note here, we no longer write on click lowercase c and then a string and then the parentheses. Instead, we write capital C. We do the curly brackets to say this is now JavaScript, and we don't execute that function. We just pass the function directly. So if we included the parentheses, maybe that's worth showing. If I go to profile here, let's say I'm going to peel this off and actually call it something. So I'll go here and I'll say const, click handler equals, and that's totally good. And then in here, if I write click handler just like that, that works like before. So if I go here, when I click then, we see that alert. The question is, what do we think happens if I write this? Because this is a common mistake you can make. What happens if I write this?
Look for a newly defined function.
Well, it's going to, because these curly brackets say, okay, everything inside of here is JavaScript, right? It sees click handler. It sees that is a JavaScript function. Then it executes it. When it executes it, it returns undefined. And so what ultimately ends up here is undefined. And so instead of the functionality being that every time I click, I now run this functionality, instead it's going to be that the minute I define it, it's going to run that functionality. And every time I click, nothing's going to happen. It's just going to, because what does on click equals undefined mean? So if I reload this now, you'll see it's already popped up there. And actually, it's even worse than I thought. I can't even dismiss it because every time it refreshes, that's happening again. So yeah, that's just another common error that you want to be careful about. You want to pass a function to it. You don't want to execute the function and pass the return statement of that function to the handler. Okay, so I guess I'm gonna modify the time we take a little bit, just because I feel like we're going at a good enough rate. I want to give you guys how about, yeah, let's give you until what is 11:05 your time, and when we come back, we'll do common patterns in React, which is just, there's still a few more things to cover of like what, like how, you know, sort of like if this is the situation, how do you do that in React? And we'll cover those. And then finally, we're gonna start this video store thing with the rest of the time. So yeah, I'll see you all at 11:05 CST. I'll stop sharing for a minute and pause the recording. Okay. Okay. So where were we? Common patterns in React. Okay. So what we've covered so far is the basic functionality of React that gives us essentially the ability to create our own HTML elements, which is basically the component itself, the idea of props, the idea of the React escape sequence, and that is enough to recreate, you know, all the functionality of HTML. But there are a few things that are like specific ideas we might want to see. So what do I have here? I have a profile with a name and an image URL. And the question is, what if I wanted to optionally render something? So what I have right now looks like this. I have, let's take out that H1 component, maybe even take out the children. Right now we have a name and an image source. And we're just going to show that name and show that image with its source, right? Let's save that. And over here, we're passing it the name and the image source. And when that renders, it looks like this. And let's say we had our profile and we said, oh, well, some profiles have, just want to take this stuff out, which isn't relevant anymore. Maybe some profiles have, maybe every profile is a name, but only some have an image associated. So let's say we didn't have the image source here. What happens? Okay, well, it actually looks fine. It seems to be smart enough about it. If I inspect here, I'll see that for this first one, I have an H2 and an image. Second one, I have an H2, and then I just have like an empty image. So something I might want to do, because this doesn't, I mean, it kind of looks fine in this case, but it's often the case that you might want to optionally render something, as in based on a condition. If that condition is true, we render it. Otherwise, we don't. And so looking here, I see I have something like this. So I could replace my profile with something like this. Here in profile, I'm going to replace it. And this is doing the same thing where I have this, you know, div. I just decided to use a div, class name profile. It has an H2, and then I have this function I'm calling called render image if image URL. And this has normal logic in it where it says, you know, we're going to call this function, and if indeed there is an image URL and it has a length greater than 0, then return that element, otherwise return nothing. And if we do it this way, we should see that, I'm not seeing, did I name that right? Image URL.
It's with line 5.
Image source, okay. What was that?
On line 5,
Mhm.
after the ampersand, if image and an image URL length.
Yeah, so we should explain that, right? What's happening there, this is just normal JavaScript, but the nature of the and is that it short circuits. So this and here is going to say if the image URL is null, then it's automatically a false. If the image URL is not null, then we check the next condition. And if image URL's length is 0, I think I want to say if image URL length is not 0, that's why it's not showing up, then I return the image source. Otherwise, I return nothing. So the and here is just that there's 2 conditions.
Gotcha. Yeah, it was that equivalence to 0. I think that threw me off. That makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, that's it. So basically what I had before was the incorrect logic because it would say only if it's 0 will it show that, which doesn't make sense. So I'm showing you this just to show you that even if we don't do anything fancy, this works. This is a way of getting conditional logic in there. But it's not so nice because we kind of broke up our render statement. Part of our render statement is this return, but then we have this specific, oh, how do I render that? So the question is, what is the common way, or what's the natural way of doing this in React? And the preferred way is using the ternary operator. So we just create an expression within that JSX. So instead of doing this, what we do is we still have the escape sequence, but we don't call a function in there. We can open it if we want. And inside of this, this escape sequence, this is where we put our conditional logic. So in this case, we'll use a ternary operator because we can't use the if else. So in here, we say, if this is the case that there is an image URL and its length is not 0. So with the ternary operator, we have our logic followed by a question mark and then followed by what it resolves to if that is true, which is this. And if that is not true, we also have to include that, so null. And it seems like I could open it up like that, or I could write it like this. Either way works. You see my auto formatter has an opinion, but this is the way we would actually want to do it. So this is the exact equivalent functionality, but instead of calling a separate function and using if-else statements, it still looks pretty simple. We just have our conditional logic in here. So sometimes it can get confusing with parentheses and escaping and stuff like that. Like you'll notice we escape this whole thing, right? And then if this is true, then this renders, right? But even in here, we had another escape sequence. So these things can get nested and it can look complicated or ugly. And if that's the case, the solution is generally not to make a separate render statement, but to create a whole new component, because a component itself is a replacement for that render statement. Like, for example, I could replace this with something like, image component. And I guess that's self-closing. And then the image component itself would, maybe be given a source equal to image source. And then within that image component, we could have whatever logic we wanted that would say like, well, first we're going to check this and that. And if so, we render the component, otherwise we don't. So you could always break things into their own components, but this is how you would do conditional logic within the return statement. So any questions about that? Because this is going to be a bread and butter tool that you use to, conditions are one of the 2 important things you might do with some data in terms of your JSX. So any questions about this approach, or we feel comfortable with the ternary operator, because that's all it is at the end of the day. Okay. Trying to check chat as well, but it doesn't always show up. There we go. So nothing in the chat. Okay. All right. So what is the next thing? Let's just see what we did here. So right, it fits in fewer lines. We're just explaining how it works. So the next thing we're going to want to do is interpolating a list. So I'm going to have to create this, but let's say I had something like this. I'm going to now replace my app. So I'm going to app here. We're going to ignore everything that's in here now and replace it outright. And what we're doing is we're returning something called profile container, which doesn't exist yet. And we pass it this list of things, right? So the first thing we want to do is actually create this profile container component. You'll see it's already complaining because it doesn't know about it. So I'll say profile container.jsx. And the body of that looks like this. So you'll see I'm importing profile here, not an app. So, app is going to import profile container, which looks like this. And when we go into profile container, that imports its own thing. And this is what profile container looks like. And what I'm showing you here. Let's see if this is going to understand, or sometimes you do need to restart it. So let's see if it understands. Yeah, we're printing these multiple components with their, or these multiple profiles with their different inputs. So basically I took this input called profiles, this prop, and it has, you know, this, they're each an object with a name and an image URL, you know, and I could change these numbers here, 3 or 2, and we'll get different size images. And then we pass that as a prop to profiles container called profiles. And then within here, we have this div, it's going to say H1 profiles. Then we have I just gave this an ID, but it doesn't really matter. And then the way I accomplish this is that we're doing this, you know, sort of just like we did the, you know, the if statement before. Now we're going to do a for statement. So what I did was I first created an empty array, and then I said for each name and image URL, push onto this list a specific component with the name and the image URL, and then finally use the React escape sequence to render those components. And even though it's a list of things, it understands what that means. And so indeed, this works, and you can give it the different values and it understands them. So that's the basic of how you you might do this using like a for statement. And you'll actually notice here, we're getting an error statement where it says each child in a list should have a unique key prop. So basically React wants each child in a list to have a unique prop called key, because then it can easily look it up through like hashing. It's basically an implementation detail, and it works fine without it, but they give you that warning. So basically what they want me to do is say key equals to, and I want that key to be unique. So one thing I could do is that I'm doing a for statement here. And for all for statements, I believe I can do this, right? Where in this case, I'm getting just that info, but I could also get like the index. Does that work? No, it doesn't seem to like that. I might have to do it a different way. So we're going to forget about that key for now, because what we're about to do is transform this. Instead of doing it this way, we want to see, well, can we do this similarly to how we did, you know, the conditional? Can we do this in line in the JSX? And the answer is we can. We do something like this. We're going to take this profiles.map thing. And this is how we would generally do it, as in, instead of doing any logic up here, we just have our return statement, and then we have an escape where we want to do something. And what do we do in that escape? What we do in that escape is we take this thing called profiles and we map it. It's a little confused. Why is it confused right now? Would not expect it to be confused. We're going to see why it's confused, but basically we have this escape sequence, and we're going to say, take that profiles thing, which is a list, map it. So each element in that profile list will look like this. Maybe it wants me to wrap these in parentheses. There we go. So each profile, or profiles is a list. Each profile has an object with name and image URL, which we're destructuring, and then we're returning an individual profile per thing. So this results in the same thing, which is a list of these profile components, and that should work just as well. The only thing is that we're noticing it's still complaining about that key thing. So how do we solve that? Well, it wants each component in a list to have a unique key. So something we can do is whenever you map something, and that's usually what we're going to do, the first argument to map is the value. In this case, name, image URL, but the second argument is actually index. So in that way, I could always know the index, and that's always going to be a unique value. So I can do this, and now it has a key. And the only difference you're going to see is that we don't have that error message anymore. And technically, React will work more efficiently, which is not noticeable with small lists, but it is noticeable with large lists. Okay, so that is how to, we've covered conditional logic now and looping logic for rendering JSX. I think that's kind of everything, but any questions on that? Because I mean, the whole point is just to make it a little neater and to have it all in that one return statement. Any questions about conditionals or looping logic within JSX? Okay, I'm not hearing anything. Yeah, so I believe that's everything up until us doing the video store. The only thing left is to push you guys for a discussion, which is why does React do things this way? So this should feel weird to you on some level, because it is weird. And you should vocalize that weirdness. As in, if it feels like, why are we doing this in React? This is the time to ask those questions, because there are reasons for everything. It's just, it's sort of like going from vanilla to JS to React, you're skipping like 20 years of thinking. And that's why React looks so strange, because it has a bunch of new ideas, and there's a reason for why it does everything the way it does, but it's not always obvious. So if anyone wants to ask some questions about why that is, go ahead. Nothing?
I do have a question. It may or may not link into the last question. The keys. I can see the reason to have them, but and having made like a little React app, I didn't have any need to pull from it. And I kind of feel like once it's made the HTML from the JSX and puts it on the screen, you don't really, it's not like with vanilla JS, I could see it because you might have to like pick it up from its ID and do something else with it. But you just go back to your state or anything else and you just re-render through the React. But it does have a very nice warning sign whenever you don't have the key. It does not like that. But I didn't see any real use for it other than just being all individual.
I think it's one of those sort of like things that's right between what the programmer should know about and what the implementer should know about. So you're not going to notice the difference unless it's a really long list. And I think it only comes into play if you change something that only affects like one element of the list or something. And then it has this key, so so React itself can instantly look it up. I just do it to get rid of the warning. I just don't like seeing the warning. I'm sure there would be a performance hit eventually, and I'm sure there's logic to why we do it that way. So if I were to go to React's like website, there's definitely going to be something on the key prop. I'm going to try key. No, key prop. Anyone? List. Yeah, so this is where it's going to explain why. Yeah, it becomes important if your array items can move due to sorting. That makes sense. Yeah. So basically, if this is a list that is going to be sort of alive, that maybe you're going to be able to like hit a button and it sorts it one way or sorts it another way, it uses the key so that it. I don't really know the details because it's an implementation detail, but basically what they're saying is that that key makes it so if you're modifying this list either by sorting it or inserting or deleting, it's going to be able to more easily pull something in or put something in without having to re-render everything. And again, it's not going to make a big difference if it's like 5 elements, but if it's like 1,000 elements, it probably will be faster. But that's the only, honestly, the main reason is to get rid of the error message. And that's a perfectly legitimate reason. And the only important thing is that the key has to be unique. But by the time you're working with real data, anything that is rendered in a list will probably have an ID associated with it. It'll have some it'll be backed up somewhere in like whatever data it's based on will be in a database somewhere and have an ID. So that's always going to be your solution. Just the ID is the key. All right. Any other questions about what we've covered so far or why React is the way it is? Because what we're going to do for the next half an hour now is we're going to essentially attempt to create this like video store thing, which in demos and notes, there's already like an example, but we're going to try and make it from scratch as much as we can. And then if you notice, when we go down here, I do mention the React Dev Tools here. Good little tool, not necessary, but helps for messing with React within Chrome. But the assignment for today and for all these days is basically to try and accomplish these exact steps on your own and make this video store website your own, using our example as like the basis, and whatever, you know, and we're gonna just gonna try and do something in a class to get started. Cool. So do we have any questions, or do we want to start the video store stuff?
Quick question. I clicked that here button, the view clickable here, and it's giving me a 404.
Yeah, that's likely just because things moved around a little. Yeah, exactly. So I just need to fix that in terms of I missed some of these references. Instead of here, it's actually going to be pointing to I'm going to close this for right now. Come on, I don't want to save that. Just give me 1 second. If we close all of this and we open up demos and notes, which I thought I had open somewhere. There we go, demos and notes. I'm just going to move that to the right thing. Again, apologies for always moving so much around on the screen. If you look at week 8, day 1, intro to React, we have that example Vite project, the HTML vanilla JS, and then we have video store part 1. That's where I'm trying to point you to.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah, and I might as well actually, I'm going to open that specifically. Week 8, day 1, video store part 1. I don't know why. There it is. Okay. Right. Yeah. And this is our video store, but I've already wrote a bunch of it. So we might want to try and write it from scratch, but then we can look at this, right? So I'll actually right here, I might as well come right out of this and I'll make a new video store for the sake of the in-class demo. But yeah, so anything else before we start trying to do the video store stuff? Okay, sounds like no. And we're going to try and do this collectively as a class. So basically, we're going to use Vite and we're going to try and accomplish these few things here. And I'm just going to scroll all the way to the top because that's where I wrote what I actually wanted to accomplish. So basically, these are the 2 things I want to accomplish: make a homepage and mock it and add some styling and then list some videos. So basically, let's start. I'm in this file, week 8, day 1, intro to React, and I want to create a new Vite project. How do I do that? So want to create a new React project. So we want to make sure we can do this because we want to be able to, like, you know, get to that hello world on our own. So anyone, how do I create a new React project?
npm install Vite, was it?
Yeah, close. It's npm create Vite. And apparently we can leave off that at latest. So npm create Vite, and that's all I write. And now it's going to say, okay, cool, create, it actually needs to install something because it's never heard of it. So I say yes. And then I say, okay, project name. Let's call this video store demo. And we'll choose React. And we'll choose JavaScript. And that's it. So now I'm going to cd into there. And it says the first thing it wants me to do is install it. And then it wants me to run it. So I'm actually going to open this up just so that we can see both. So I'll put this on layaway for a second. Right now, we're going to be in our new project over here. I believe that's what this is, right? Video store. I'm not sure which one was which. This is the one we want. Okay. Great. So this is our video store. We're starting from scratch. We haven't done anything yet. So first I have to do npm install, just so you see if I try to do npm run dev, it's going to say, I don't know what Vite is because it goes in here and it tries to run Vite and it doesn't know what that is. So I have to do npm install first. Takes a minute, but we get our node modules, our package lock. And now if I try the same thing, I should be able to go here, 5173. And I'm going to reload it. And yeah, this is the page. Cool. And now the first thing I want to do is just get rid of some stuff. So basically, I mean, I really just want to wipe out app.js initially. I'm just going to take everything out besides this. Maybe I'll put an H1 in there so I can see it. And we don't want this. And we don't want any of these. And for right now, let's leave that CSS stuff in there. So this is what it looks like. It is working, and it is working fine, but I want to take out the CSS they already have and replace it with our own. So for now, I'm just going to take that out, and I'll take this out. But just we can do that on our own. So for right now, I'll just go to app.css, and we don't really understand most of this stuff, so let's get rid of it like that. And similarly, index.css, maybe we will just leave it. It's just some basic stuff that it wants all buttons and things like that to look like. So we'll leave it in there. That's just being pulled in over here. But yeah, so right now we should have a basic site. I see, well, I kind of don't like that hello world is where it is and why is it where it is.
You're loading another CSS file. So
Yeah.
it's like main.cs or something like that. That's
Yeah.
one of the defaults. Or index.css.
Yeah, so some part of that is making it, so this index.css, like I kind of wanted to leave it in there, but it is putting things in the center. Okay, I never even heard of this, place items, but we're just going to get rid of, we'll just get rid of it entirely. No, none of that either. Take that out. And so now we have no CSS. Now it's just a basic HTML page, or, there's no CSS going on. And so our goal now, if we go back here, this is what we want to do. So maybe I'll just create a README so I can see that, readme.md. And this is what we're trying to accomplish, a home page and displaying a list of videos. And you might ask, well, what is the list of videos? Eventually, you'll want to speak to a backend. But for right now, let me see if I can, sorry for all the jumping around again. Let me see if I can just grab that from my version of demos and notes. So CD Tango, demos and notes, week 8, day 1. And I call that video store part 1. And inside of source, I believe I should have something called data. So I'm just going to copy that folder over. So I'm going to copy. You have to copy recursively, I forget, data. And where do I want to copy it to? I want to copy it to video store demo source. Okay. So now I added this thing called data from there. And data is just this thing I made called inventory.json. It's not really all that, there's not that much going on. I just gave everything a title. I gave it an image URL that I took from fandango.com. And a number of copies available. And the idea is we want to use this info now to render stuff in our app. Okay, so we don't really need to think about main. App is our starting point. This is all it looks like. And the first thing I want to do is get that data in there because it's going to matter, right? I'm going to need that data. So how would I get this data in there? You don't have to be right.
Import.
Yeah, I mean, as it turns out, just like with the CSS, you can just import a JSON file. So I could say something like import, I think I can just say it like this, like import inventory from / does it know where I am? Data, that's right. Data, / inventory. Cool. And to test that this is working, how about I just write over here console.log inventory just to see if it's working. And when I go here, I see that indeed in the console, even though it prints it twice, we have all that data. Cool. So we already have our data. And now we're going to want to use this data to create a home page, right? So I look here, I say, okay, we want a home page. We're eventually going to want to display these videos. So let's just start designing this page. Like, what do we want our home page to look like? I can show you what might be nice to see that in here, if I go to, where are we? W8D1, video store part 1. I think this is going to conflict with the original one, but npm install, npm run dev. There's usually a way to say, go to a different port, or maybe it even knows. So this is what it looks like right now. And we just can recreate this if we want, or we can make it better. So as you can see, like sometimes you end up having to focus far too much on CSS. We might want to leave that CSS off right now. But if I look at the CSS I did create here, it's not that complex. It's just, you know, I have, you know, display flexes all over the place, and I'm giving specific things, specific, you know, properties for the sake of layout or creating a border. But for right now, maybe we won't focus on the CSS. You can focus on that a little more for making your own nice. The main thing is that we recreate this functionality here. So I'm going to want an H1 for video store, and then I'm going to have this inventory thing, and then each one of those is going to have its own thing. So they talk about this on the React site, that if you go to react.dev, learn React, you'll see they have this thing called like describing the UI or thinking in React. I know that's somewhere, thinking in React. So yeah, thinking in React is going to tell you like, hey, how do you work in React? Well, look at what you want your whole page to look like, and then start breaking it up into individual bits of UI. So we can look at this whole thing and say like, oh, well, we have the, you know, a container for everything. And then we have the specific container for the search bar. And then maybe that's broken down a little more. And then we have a product table, and maybe it has a category row, and then it has individual products, and then another category row and individual products. So just by looking at it visually, you can kind of get a sense of like, maybe we want to have this component inside of this component, inside of this component. And there's no right answers really there. It's just over time, you kind of figure out what is a good way of breaking things up. So the way I see it, at the very least, at the very outside, we're going to have an H1. And then within it, we're going to have this container I'm going to call inventory, which can contain multiple movies. Okay, so first thing I'm wrapping it all in a div right now. And I have this H1, and we'll just call it video store. And we're not going to make it look too nice. And then the next thing I'm going to want is some kind of like container, right? So this whole inventory thing here is probably one object like that. So this is our header maybe, and this is our main. Cool. So let's create that. So we're going to call this component title container, as it contains, or maybe inventory container. How about that? Inventory container. And for right now, I'll just make it self-closing, and it's not defined, so I'm going to have to import it, but also create it. So I'll write something like this: inventory container from, and then I like to put things in a folder called components, and then we're going to name it inventory container. And finally, we're going to create that file, because right now it's going to be confused. That doesn't exist. So does anyone want to walk me through creating a, let's say right here in source, I'm going to make a new folder called components. And now how do I create this inventory container component?
Right click and create file. A new file.
Yeah, and what should we call it?
Inventory container.
Dot
.jsx.
JSX, you got it. And what should we put in here?
Oh, that one was, some export default. I forget.
Yeah, export default is always nice because that's going to line it up with the import. So export default, and then what are we exporting?
Function, inventory container.
Inventory container.
Function. And we want to give that function a name, which is the same as the file, which is the component. And we're not even going to give it props yet because we don't have any. And then what do we want the body to be?
Return.
We definitely want to return something. I mean, we could also do something before, but it's not a component unless we return something. And we
Return
said,
a div or something like that, or like within the brackets or within the parentheses.
yeah, so it sounds like we're going to want to return more than one thing. You know, maybe we'll use that fragment thing here. And then we said we want, you know, we're going to be displaying a list of videos. So I'm just going to say, well, we'll have an H2 that says like, I just want to recreate this. So it says inventory. Okay. So my H2 is going to say inventory. And then within that inventory, we're going to have some kind of
UL or
well, we could use ULs, but as we see, we kind of want it to be like this list. So I think it makes more sense to be a div, and then maybe we'll mess with flex. So we'll just make it a div right now, and I'll give that div a class so that we can mess with it in CSS, and I'll call that class inventory container, inventory container. Maybe I'll write it like that. And we'll mess with that in a bit, but for right now, we have nothing in there. Let's just put some dummy data. So div A, because we have 4 movies, I'll just try A, B. What did I lose? Okay.
Hey, Ben, shouldn't that class be class name?
Yes.
I recall you
very
saying
good.
something.
I mess that up all the time. Very good. Yeah, it should be class name and it will warn you. Yeah. And I see this is still struggling probably because I added a new element. So let's try that again. And this is what it looks like right now, which, okay, it's not, you know, not exactly this, but that's mostly styling. And maybe the first thing I want to do is I want to say like, okay, well, I want there to be a box around the inventory and I want the things inside of it to be like organized left to right. So how do you think we might accomplish that? Box around inventory and organize left to right, not top to bottom. Let's just start with a box. How do we get a box around inventory?
Or the CSS.
CSS, yeah, both of these problems are going to be CSS. So I can see here if I just add to that element, if I just say like, okay, border 3 pixels dotted black, that's going to give me a, well, actually, it's only wrapping that H2 now, but we're going to do it right the next time and put it on this whole div. And as you see, of course, if I reload, that change is gone. So let's do it in our JavaScript. And so the first thing I'm going to do is say, okay, well, I have this class name here. Well, might as well import some CSS. I could import unique CSS here, and there's a couple ways to do CSS with React, but basically the fact that I have app.jsx here, I can just write import, you know, /, does it, should know about it. I think that will work. And to see it work, let me just try and do something like, you know, everything is going to have a background color of red. So if I see a lot of red, then it worked. I see a lot of red. Okay, so our CSS is working. And now let's, you know, even though we're importing it here, this is going to be for the whole file. So we'll put all of our CSS in here. And this inventory container has a class name of inventory-container. So what do I want to write here to target that? What's the selector to target that?
.inventory container.
Exactly. So it's a class of .inventory container. And the first thing I wanted to do was add that border So let's just say 3 pixels and solid and black, because that's simple enough. And now if I look back here, oh, we're only wrapping that part. Interesting. So let's say I want to wrap that whole little section. Well, then that wasn't a good idea to put it here. Instead, maybe I want to do something like this. Actually make this a div, make that the class name. And we'll leave this for something like, we'll call this like inventory list or something. Okay, so now we have something wrapping the whole thing. And then importantly, we wanted the A, B, C, and D to be left to right, okay? So how do we want to accomplish that? Note A, B, C, and D are all divs that are inside of a div called with class name of inventory list. So how do we make them go left to right instead of top to bottom?
Flexbox, then align direction right.
Yep, exactly. So let me go to my CSS here and I'm going to add a new class inventory list and I'm going to say display flex. And then maybe I'll say flex direction, which is going to be row. And I believe that's actually enough. So if I look at it now, they are in order. And that is more or less enough, but they're going to be right next to each other. So this gap thing is pretty useful. I can say something like gap 5%. And now if I look at it, they're slightly further apart to represent that gap. And of course, I could take that whole inventory thing and say like, well, actually, I want to have like some like margins or something, or actually padding because I want more space on the bottom here. So maybe I'll say something like up here, padding bottom. And I'll just give it something like, well, can I just say like 5%? Does that work? That works, yeah. I want even less. But as you maybe can see, I mean, you can spend all day on CSS and get very finicky about it. Kind of like in this box itself, I would kind of like to have left padding as well. So maybe we're just going to say padding in general. Looks like, you know, that. Now we have some space. Cool. So our next thing we want is to actually show each one of those movies, right? So how do we do that? Well, right now we're just showing these A's and stuff, but what if I had something in here called, you know, inventory item? And again, I don't have one yet, so I have to create it and I'll import it like this. Import inventory, just copy and paste that. Or inventory item from, and it doesn't exist yet, but it's going to be in the components folder and I'll call it inventory item. And it's going to complain because it doesn't exist, but now let's make it inventory item.js. Very hard to spell inventory, surprisingly. Inventory item, cool. And as always, just export default inventory. No, not quite. Inventory item, not giving it any arguments yet. And we're just going to return, oh, I left out the word function. It's a function called inventory item. We're just going to quickly return, you know, let's say an H3 with, we're just going to write inventory item because we haven't really made it specific yet. I might have to restart this again because when you add a new file, it often is confused about that. Okay, and yeah, we see it now as in I have ABCD and then I have the word inventory item. And if I look at this in the HTML, I have this list and there's a bunch of things there. It's not perfectly aligned, but it's good enough for now, right? So if I'm looking at my README, I have a basic homepage, and now I wanted to display this list of videos, right? So going all the way back here, I have the inventory. The question is, how do I get that, you know, this inventory.json has data in it for individual inventory items. So how do I get that data from app where I loaded it into this specific inventory item? Does anyone want to walk through that process? And I'll give you the answer for how. The answer is props. But, you know, there's going to be a couple steps here. So what's the first thing we want to do if we're trying to pass this inventory list down to this level?
Would you destructure the dictionary of the JSON object?
Yeah, and we could, but the first things first is we just want, basically inventory is not so useful here. And we eventually want to like map it, right? Because it's a list. But we're stuck, we don't have access to it here. I mean, we could have imported it here, but first steps first, let's just make a prop. So we're gonna say, and sometimes you end up making props just to pass something down. That's sometimes referred to as prop drilling. It can get tiring and there's ways around it, but the first things first, let's just say, okay, well,
That's an inventory, yeah.
yeah, we're just gonna pass an inventory and we're gonna call it inventory. Simple enough. And then in here,
Your typo back in the.
yeah, we can just include it in here called inventory. And now we can say console.log inventory.
You have a typo.
You have a
in it.
typo.
I'm sure I do. Where?
In app.jsx
Okay.
under inventory.
Yeah, it's a hard word. It's one hard word. Cool. You can probably tell that that's a good point that if I, you know, it's grayed out and then when I spell it right, it's not grayed out. So generally you don't want anything grayed out in your imports because it means you're not using it. Why did you import it? So now it should work where I should be able to reload this and I see I am still printing things, but I'm printing it from inventory container. Cool. So I have access to it in inventory container. And now this is kind of the hardest part. Given that I have this inventory, which remember, look here, it's just a list of individual objects with the same key value pairs. How do I turn this list into a list of inventory items? Like, I don't really want these, right? So how do I transform this list called inventory into a list of inventory items? Let's just say for right now, we don't even care what's inside of it. We just want one inventory item for every item in this inventory list. How might I do that?
With the map.
Yeah, so in order to do that map, what do we first have to do? Like, can I just write inventory.map right here?
No, you're gonna have to store it in something.
Gonna have to what?
So you have to like store it, like create a list to store it in.
Well, that's one way we could, the point I'm trying to make here is that if I write inventory.map and I save this, we're just going to see
You can't just write JS. You kind of like JavaScript and like that.
What was that?
You put it in the brackets, right?
That's
So
right. Exactly. So first things first, we have to do something like this. And now that works, but of course it's going to complain that if we actually run it, it's going to say undefined is not a function. And that's not so clear, but what it's saying is you can't just say inventory.map, map what to what. Right? It's expecting a function here. So what is that function? Well, first that function takes an argument, maybe more than one, and that should
so
be value.
Yeah, you take each of those things and then it's going to return the inventory item of that thing.
Yeah, so I'm going to name it like item and index. And I can just do it right here. And I'll say that for each one of those items, I'll make an inventory item. And I'm not even using item yet, but we should have 4 inventory items now. And we do. But we're getting that error about the keys. So I'm going to add that. I'm just going to say each inventory item has a key equal to the index. And now we have our list of inventory items and no errors. So our final step is we have this inventory item. We're not passing it item yet. How do we pass it item? And once we do that, what do we want to do here? So remember, each inventory item is going to look like this. So each inventory item has a title, an image URL, and copies available. How do we want to pass that from here into this actual component?
Yeah, so like after inventory item, you have to pass it. You got to make something called like, I don't know, movie, equals and then brackets item.
Sure, yeah. And if we're gonna name it movie, I might as well just say, okay, we're gonna call it movie. And we can just say movie equals movie.
Yeah.
We could have broken it down more, but what this means is that at the other end, at inventory item, what do we do now?
You take the
Pass a
props,
movie.
What was that?
or you could do the brackets with movie.
Yeah, I prefer the brackets, and we don't actually want key, we just want movie, right? And that's what we called it. So for each item, it's a movie, and we pass that movie in. And now from here, for each inventory item, I should be able to say console.log movie and make sure that it's the right thing. And let's see, I'm going to reload. And yeah, you can see that even though it looks like it's all printing from the same place, each one of these items is printing its particular copy of its inventory item. Cool. So we're basically there. We have it. One thing I'm going to do now is going to say, well, there's actually a couple things in there and I want to destructure it. So I'm going to say a movie, which we passed in, is equal to, and what is it equal to? Each one is going to have a title, an image URL, and copies available. So we're going to name it title, image URL, copies available. And just to make sure I actually wrote those right, let me just log all of those. Title, image URL. Because if you spell it even a little wrong, it won't understand, which is just a classic JavaScript issue. So I'm going to reload it. And yeah, it looks like everything is printing as expected. I feel good about just seeing the information. So now that we have all this, what do we want our profile to look like? Maybe I'm going to open it up like this, and maybe I'll do that just so we have something. And what do we want to show? Like, what is a if we look at this example here, you know, we have, this is what each one looks like. So can we get all of this? So at the very least, let's show the title, right? How do we show the title? Any
We'll just put it in like a whatever H2, whatever, yeah. And then you can just give it title with brackets.
Yeah, exactly. So brackets are all we need. And we come back here and we see, yeah, we're showing each one. And we just keep doing this. I can say like, well, you know, then there below that's going to be an image. And image is actually self-closing. So let's just go like that. And then we're going to say the source of the image, escape, is image URL. And let's see what that looks like. Okay, it's working. At this point, you can see how, well, I kind of need more CSS, and we're almost running out of time, but that kind of means I actually need to make it a div because otherwise I can't give it a class. And I'll say class name equals to, and then I'll say inventory item, right? Inventory item. Then I could do the same thing I did before, where now I have a dot inventory item. And again, I'll say display flex, but this time it's a flex direction column. And now if I look at it, it's looking a little better. And finally, to fill it all out, I'll just say like, okay, we have this number available and checkout. And so if I come back here, I could say something like, well, first I'm just going to have this little, I'll use a pre and I'll say, you know, copies available. And then in there, I'll actually write the number of copies available. So we're getting pretty close. You know, even if I made it a little nicer, maybe I'd make it more like a P. And it would just be this that looks like the pre, because that looks a little nicer to me. So this is still perfectly valid. And the last thing we wanted to show, and it looks, whatever. I'm not, let's just go back. It was fine. The last thing we want to show is just like, let's say we have this button. So we're going to go over by like just a minute, but this button here, you see how it's disabled here, and it's because we have 0 available. And here, if I click checkout, it says if this worked, we would have 3 copies. So we don't really have live data right now. But at the very least, we can implement this thing where we say you can only check something out if you have a number of things available. So maybe I would have a button here. And that button would say check out. And we'd have an on click for that button. And I'll just do it in line where I'll say, I don't care what kind of input it has, but the output is just to say alert. And maybe when I say alert, I'm going to say you checked out title. So that should work. Now I have this checkout. I'm going to say checkout, you checked out Shazam, checkout, you checked out 65. And then importantly, I want this to be disabled. And I can do that in that button can have another thing on it. So you'll see it will often autocomplete. So disabled is one. And if disabled is true, it will be disabled. So something I can do is I can say, something like, if copies available is identical to 0, that's it. If copies available is identical to 0, disable it. Otherwise, it will be enabled. And you see it's true. We can't check that one out. Can't even click it now. And the last thing to show is just this line is getting kind of long, right? Well, you don't have to it doesn't have to be on one line. So people eventually start doing this, where each individual thing is each individual prop is provided in a row, and so you could still keep it all in a line. Just going to check the chat quickly. Yes, I just want to answer Will's question. Why does it console.log twice? The reason it's console.logging twice, as far as I know, is because of this strict mode thing. So I believe if we actually took that out, if we were to comment that out and just replace it with just app, I believe now, if you reran this, it's only printing everything one time. So I mentioned this earlier, but it's sort of an advanced thing. Like you want to keep strict mode on, but strict mode is going to render everything twice. And so you'll see everything twice. And the reason it's doing that is because there's certain errors that only appear on a second render. And it's just trying to sort of like help you see that before it hits production. But it's not really that essential. But yeah, we've covered everything now. We're 3 minutes over, so we should wrap up. But when you come back after lunch, the goal is just to create this much functionality. So you're trying to accomplish exactly what we just did in the video store, and then you can build on it if you want. But the point of this is that we're going to build on it over time. So just to give you a little preview, like this is where I started, and at least by day 3, if we go here, like let me get out of that, and I'm gonna if I go to week 8, day 3, async and react, video store part 3, npm install, npm run dev. I didn't write that correctly. You actually do see this error sometimes. It basically wants me to remove node modules and reinstall. So this should solve that error we just saw. And it does, cool. So that's another good thing to know in the world of front end. A good debugging tool, just like turning it on and off, is delete node modules, reinstall node modules. It sometimes solves the problem. So basically, this is my slightly better video store. You'll see I have, a certain number of each one available. I can click it, and then it's going to give me details. I can clear that out, click a different one. I can check out or return. If I check out, there's one less. If I check out to none, there's none left. And then I can return a bunch of them. And this information is not just coming from something I did locally, but actually there's some IMDb-based API that is giving me, this poster and description and all of that. So, still not a super impressive website. But the point is that over time, we're going to keep building it out. And really, you can make this site as nice as you want. You also, you don't even have to stick to the idea of a video store if you have a different idea. The point is just we want you to practice just making a site with the tools we've currently taught. And so up until what we taught, you should be able to make a static site, basically, meaning it's not talking to a backend, it's not doing anything super fancy, but you can display stuff and it will react to certain things. We've already covered enough that you should be able to do on click, things like that. So yeah, that's the task for today when we get back. Cool. So that is it for right now. I'm going to stop sharing. And I'm going to stop recording.